The letter arrived after reality itself had already changed. "Welcome to Holmes Mystery. I am your host, Lucien Moreau. Let me know where you're listening from in the comments. It means more than you know. Let's begin." Lestrade stepped briskly into the room, his eyes darting from the body to the scattered objects upon the table, and finally settling upon Holmes with a mixture of relief and wary irritation. "Well, Mr. Holmes," said he, removing his gloves with quick, nervous movements, "this is a queer business. We had word from the servant below that her master had taken suddenly ill, but I see it is something more serious. What have you found?" "Only that Mr. Septimus Rainsford had the foresight to summon us before his death," Holmes replied calmly, "and the misfortune to die before he could profit from our assistance." Lestrade sniffed and stepped closer to the chair, bending to inspect the still form. No sign of robbery, no disturbance. Looks peaceful enough, save for that mark. What do you make of it?" "A puncture wound of very fine caliber," I said. "Possibly inflicted by a narrow instrument, a needle or stiletto. There is no immediate swelling, which suggests the introduction of a toxin." Lestrade straightened. "Poison, eh? That's more in your line, Doctor. But how was it administered? No one saw anyone enter or leave, according to the maid." Holmes had already moved to the fireplace, where he stood, warming his hands, though I knew well it was but a pose adopted when his mind was most active. "You say no one saw anyone enter or leave, yet Mr. Rainsford is dead by violence. And therefore either someone entered unseen, or the means of death was already present within the room." Lestrade gave a short laugh. "Or the man did it himself." Holmes turned his head slightly. "With a puncture in the temple? A curious choice for suicide, Inspector, and one requiring a steadiness of hand seldom found in the act of self-destruction." Lestrade grunted but did not press the point. Instead, his gaze fell upon the writing table. "What's this, then? A letter?" Holmes stepped forward at once. "A document addressed to me, which I have already secured for examination." Lestrade's brows drew together. "Now see here, Mr. Holmes." "You may rest assured," Holmes interrupted smoothly, "that any information relevant to your investigation shall be shared in due course. For the present, I would suggest that your attention is better directed toward the immediate circumstances of the death." There was a moment's tension, but Lestrade, who had long experience of Holmes's methods, merely shrugged. "Very well, we'll have the official view soon enough. In the meantime—" He turned sharply to the door. "Send up the maid again." The trembling girl reappeared, wringing her hands in her apron. "Now then," said Lestrade, softening his tone slightly, "tell us exactly what happened." I was in the kitchen, sir," she stammered. "Mr. Rainsford had been writing since the afternoon. He told me he expected visitors and was not to be disturbed. And then not 10 minutes before you gentlemen came, I heard a sort of cry, or perhaps it was the chair scraping. I came up at once and found him like that." She gestured helplessly toward the body. "And I ran for help." "You saw no one leave the house?" "No, sir, no one at all." "And the door?" "It was closed but not locked." Holmes, who had been examining the carpet near the chair, now spoke without looking up. "Did your master receive any visitors earlier in the day?" "No, sir, only the post in the morning." "And this letter he was writing? Did you see it before he began?" "No, sir. He took the paper from his desk." Holmes rose and crossed to the writing table, his fingers moving lightly over its surface. "May I?" Lestrade nodded curtly. Holmes opened a drawer and withdrew a small stack of unused sheets. He held one up to the light, then compared it with a glance to the letter he had taken. "The same paper," he murmured. "And yet—" "What is it?" I asked. He did not answer at once, but instead bent closer to the table, examining the inkstand, the pen, and the blotter. At last He gave a soft exclamation. "Watson, observe this." I joined him. Upon the blotter were several faint impressions of writing, as is common when one writes upon a sheet placed above it. Holmes angled it toward the lamp, and with some effort I discerned reversed lines of text. "It appears he began more than one draft," I said. "Just so, but note the difference in pressure. The earlier lines are firm, decisive. The later ones are weak and uneven." Lestrade leaned in. "What of it?" "It suggests," said Holmes, "that whatever befell Mr. Rainsford occurred while he was in the act of writing. He did not complete his task in a steady progression, but was interrupted, fatally interrupted." He replaced the blotter and turned his attention once more to the room. And his gaze lingered upon the window, then upon a narrow cabinet against the wall. "May I open that?" Lestrade nodded again. Inside the cabinet were arranged a number of small cases and boxes, each neatly labelled, in a fine, precise hand. Holmes selected one at random and opened it. Within lay a collection of yellowed documents tied with ribbon. "A scholar indeed," said Holmes. "A man devoted to the preservation of the past." "Or to secrets," Lestrade muttered. Holmes smiled faintly. "The two are often synonymous." He replaced the case and closed the cabinet. Then, quite suddenly, he crossed to the window and drew aside the curtain. The glass was misted with condensation from within, but Holmes wiped a small circle clear with his sleeve and peered out into the fog. "What do you see?" I asked. "Nothing," said he. "And that, in itself, is something." He turned back, his expression now sharpened to that keen edge I had come to recognize as the prelude to action. "Inspector, I would advise that no one leaves this house until we have completed our examination. There are elements here which do not conform to the ordinary pattern of crime." Lestrade frowned. "You mean besides the dead man?" "I mean," said Holmes quietly, "that Mr. Rainsford believed himself to be writing under conditions which had altered the very nature of his reality." Lestrade gave a short, incredulous laugh. "Come now, Mr. Holmes." But Holmes raised a hand. "I do not ask you to accept the phrase, I merely ask you to remember it." There was a pause, heavy with unspoken questions. The fog pressed against the window like a living thing, and the lamplight flickered as though disturbed by some unseen current. Then Holmes reached into his pocket and touched the folded letter. "Watson," said he softly, "we must return to Baker Street at once. There is work to be done, work of a most delicate and unusual kind." "And the body?" I asked. "Will remain," said he. "It has told us all it can, for the moment." As we descended the narrow stair, I could not shake the uneasy conviction that we were leaving behind not merely a crime, but the threshold of something far stranger. And though I had faced danger at Holmes's side on many occasions, I confess that the words of the dead man's letter echoed in my mind with a peculiar and chilling persistence. The world is no longer the one in which I first put pen to paper. We stepped out once more into the fog-laden street, and for some minutes neither of us spoke. Holmes walked at a rapid pace, his head slightly inclined, his hands thrust deep into the pockets of his overcoat. I had learned by long experience that when he assumed such a manner, it was best not to interrupt the current of his thoughts, for it ran swift and deep, and any intrusion might disturb its course. Yet the strangeness of the case pressed heavily upon me. "Holmes," said I at last, "you cannot expect me to remain silent when a man dies under such circumstances and leaves behind so extraordinary a message. What do you make of it? Surely you do not entertain the notion that reality itself has changed?" he interjected quietly. I was about to say something less extravagant. Holmes gave a faint smile, though his eyes remained fixed ahead. "My dear Watson, the first principle of investigation is not to decide prematurely what is extravagant and what is not. The history of science is littered with truths which appeared absurd until they were understood. That said, I do not for a moment suppose that the laws of nature have been overturned in Belliard this evening." Then what did he mean? "That," said Holmes, "is precisely what we must discover. But observe, he does not claim that reality has changed. He writes as though he himself has perceived such a change. There is a distinction, and a vital one. You believe him mistaken? I believe him sincere. And sincerity, Watson, is often far more dangerous than deception." We had by this time reached Baker Street. Holmes let us in with his key, and within a few moments we were once more in the familiar comfort of our sitting room, where the fire burned brightly, and the oppressive damp of the night seemed held at bay. Holmes wasted no time. He removed his coat, cast it aside, and at once took out the folded letter from Rainsford, smoothing it carefully upon the table beneath the lamp. "Now," said he, seating himself and steepling his fingers, "let us examine the dying statement of Mr. Septimus Rainsford with the attention it deserves." I drew my chair closer, and together we read: "To Mr. Sherlock Holmes, if this reaches you, then the world is no longer the one in which I first put pen to paper. I am aware of how such a statement must sound, but I beg you to suspend judgment until you have considered the facts. 3 days ago I came into possession of a document of singular character, one which I now believe should never have been read by human eyes. And since that time I have observed discrepancies, small at first, but increasing in frequency and severity. Objects are not where they were. Words upon the page alter themselves. Events which I recall with certainty are contradicted by all evidence. I am not mad. I have taken steps to verify my senses, and yet the inconsistencies persist. Worse still, I have reason to believe that I am not the only one aware of them, and that another seeks to ensure my silence. If anything should happen to me, I implore you to examine the enclosed—" The letter ended abruptly. "To examine the enclosed," I repeated, but there was nothing enclosed. "Precisely," said Holmes. He leaned back, his eyes half closed. "A man of method, Watson. Observe the structure of his thoughts. He begins with an assertion designed to shock, then immediately tempers it with an appeal to reason. He proceeds to list observations, concrete, verifiable, or so he believes. Finally, he introduces a threat, another party aware of his condition. It is a logical progression, not the rambling of a disordered mind. And yet, altering words, contradictory events, it sounds like delusion or manipulation," said Holmes softly. I looked at him sharply. "Manipulation? By whom?" "That is the question, but consider, if one wished to convince a man that his perceptions were unreliable, if one wished to isolate him, to render his testimony worthless, what more effective method than to introduce small, consistent alterations into his environment?" "You mean someone tampered with his surroundings?" "Or with the records of them," Holmes replied. "Books, documents, correspondence. A scholar such as Rainsford would rely heavily upon written material. If that material were subtly altered, if dates shifted, words changed, he might well begin to doubt his own memory. But that would require access to everything he possessed." "Indeed, and thus we must ask who had such access." Holmes rose abruptly and began to pace the room. "There is also the matter of the missing enclosure. He clearly intended to include something of importance. Yet it is absent. Taken by the murderer? Most likely, which suggests that the object in question is central to the case. I considered this. The document of singular character he mentioned. Just so. Holmes paused by the mantelpiece, his gaze fixed upon the fire. And now we come to the most curious element of all. What is that? The timing, said he.
Rainsford writes that his perceptions have altered over the course of 3 days. He sends for us in urgency. He is killed before we arrive, and yet... He turned suddenly toward me. The letter itself. What of it? Holmes snatched it up and held it before me. Look closely, Watson. Not at the words, but at the ink. I did as he directed. At first I saw nothing unusual, but then, as I tilted the page toward the light, I noticed a subtle variation. The ink, some of it is darker. Precisely. The earlier lines have begun to fade slightly, while the later ones remain fresh. Meaning he wrote it over a period of time? Or, said Holmes, his voice dropping, that the earlier words are older than they ought to be. I stared at him. You cannot mean... I mean only this, he said calmly.
That the physical evidence does not entirely accord with the apparent sequence of events. There was a silence between us, broken only by the ticking of the clock upon the mantel. At length I said, Holmes, if what you suggest is true, then we are dealing not merely with murder, but with something far more intricate. Holmes's eyes gleamed. My dear Watson, we are always dealing with something more intricate. It is merely that on occasion the intricacy rises to the surface. He reached for his violin, drew the bow once across the strings, and then set it aside again with a sharp motion. No, said he, music will not serve tonight. He turned back to the table and gathered up the letter. We must return to Belliard in the morning. There are details which require daylight, and perhaps, he added thoughtfully, all's a different perspective. And in the meantime? Holmes smiled faintly. In the meantime, Watson, we must consider the possibility that Mr. Rainsford was correct in one respect. And that is? That someone, said Sherlock Holmes, was indeed attempting to alter the world, at least as far as he was concerned. The fire crackled softly, and beyond the window the fog pressed close, as though London itself were listening. Holmes slept little that night. I was awakened more than once by the soft creak of the floorboards and the faint glow of the lamp as he moved about the room, now pausing at the table where Rainsford's letter lay, now standing motionless by the window as though peering through the fog into some unseen pattern beyond. When at last I rose, it was to find him already dressed, his keen features sharpened by wakefulness and intent. You have been up long, said I. Since 4, he replied. The mind, when confronted with a problem of unusual character, is not easily persuaded to rest. And you have reached some conclusion? I have reached several, said he, and discarded most of them. That which remains is not yet a conclusion, but it is at least a direction. He took up his hat and cane. Come, Watson, the sooner we return to Belliard, the sooner we may test it. The fog had lifted somewhat, leaving behind a damp, grey morning, through which the city stirred reluctantly to life. Our journey was swift, and we found Belliard already in a state of subdued agitation. A constable stood at the entrance, and within, Prudy the maid, pale and hollow-eyed, was engaged in anxious conversation with a clerk-like gentleman whom I took to be a representative of some legal office nearby. Lestrade himself was upstairs and greeted us with a curt nod as we entered the fatal room once more. Good morning, Mr. Holmes. I thought you'd be back. Nothing much changed here, I'm afraid. On the contrary, said Holmes, glancing about him. Everything has changed. It is merely a question of whether we can perceive it. Lestrade gave a short laugh. You're in one of your moods, I see. I am in a mood for accuracy, Inspector. Holmes moved at once to the writing table, where the objects remained much as we had left them. The chair had been slightly shifted and the body removed, but the rest was undisturbed. Has anything been taken or added since last night? Holmes asked.
Nothing, said Lestrade. We've had a man on the door the whole time. Holmes nodded as though satisfied, and then began a slow and methodical examination of the room. He measured distances with his eye, tested the firmness of the carpet beneath his foot, and inspected the surface of the desk with a lens drawn from his pocket. I watched him closely, for I knew that in such moments even the smallest gesture might carry significance. "Watson," said he at last, without looking up, "do you recall precisely where the penholder lay when we entered?" "Near the right hand," I answered. "Upon the carpet?" "And the angle?" I hesitated. "I cannot say with certainty." Holmes gave a slight sigh. "No matter. We must rely upon what remains." He rose and crossed to the window, examining the latch and frame with particular care. Then,
It is quite unexpectedly he opened it. A chill breath of morning air entered, carrying with it the faint sounds of the street below. Lestrade started. "What are you doing? We've kept everything just as it was." "And I am about to disturb nothing that matters," Holmes replied calmly. He leaned out slightly, scanning the exterior wall and the narrow space between buildings. After a moment he withdrew and closed the window again. "No marks," said he, "no sign of entry from without. As expected." "Then we're back where we started," Lestrade remarked. "Not entirely," said Holmes. He returned to the desk and with great delicacy lifted the blotter once more. This time, however, he did not merely observe it, but turned it over. "Ah! What is it now?" I asked. Holmes beckoned me closer. Upon the underside of the blotter, faint but unmistakable, it were several indentations, marks not of writing but of pressure, as though something had been placed upon it. "These were not visible last night," said Holmes. Lestrade frowned. "You're certain of that?" "Quite certain." "Then how do you account for them appearing now?" Holmes straightened slowly. "That, Inspector, is precisely what interests me." He replaced the blotter and turned to the maid, who stood anxiously by the door. "Miss, has anyone entered this room since we left it?" "No, sir," she said at once. "No one but the police." "And you yourself?" "Only to tidy the fire, sir, but I did not touch the desk." Holmes studied her face for a moment, then nodded. "I believe you." He turned back to us. "Let us consider the facts. A man writes a letter in which he claims that objects and words are altering. He is interrupted and killed before he can complete it. We examine the room and find no sign of intrusion. We return in the morning and discover a new physical detail, one which was not present before." Lestrade shifted uneasily. "You're not suggesting—" "I am suggesting nothing," said Holmes sharply. "I am observing. It is for us to determine whether the change is real or merely apparent." He reached into his pocket and withdrew Rainsford's letter. "Now, Watson, I would ask you to compare this with your recollection of it." I took the sheet and read it once more, my mind striving to fix each word as it had appeared the night before. At first all seemed the same, but then, with a sudden jolt, I noticed it. Holmes, this line, "Yes, I have taken steps to verify my senses." I do not recall the word verify. I thought it was test. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Excellent, Watson. You confirm my own impression." Lestrade stared from one to the other of us. "This is nonsense. Words don't just change themselves." "No," said Holmes quietly, "but records may be altered. And if the alteration is sufficiently subtle, if it occurs after the fact, then even a careful observer may doubt his own memory." He took the letter back and folded it neatly. "We are faced, gentlemen, with a most singular problem. Either our perceptions are unreliable, or someone is engaged in a systematic effort to render them so. And to what end? I asked. Holmes's gaze drifted once more about the room, lingering upon the cabinet of documents. To conceal something, said he softly. Something which existed yesterday, or one which, if our unfortunate client is to be believed, may not exist today in quite the same form. A silence followed, heavy with implication. Then Holmes clapped his hands together with sudden energy. Come, Watson, there is nothing more to be gained here at present. Our next step lies not in this room, but in discovering the nature of the document which Mr. Rainsford so unwisely chose to read. And how do you propose to do that? I asked. Holmes smiled thinly. By finding out, said he, who else knew of its existence and who stood to benefit most from its disappearance. Holmes wasted no further time within the confines of Bell Yard. His manner, though outwardly composed, bore that unmistakable quickening which signified that some thread, still invisible to me, had been seized and followed. As we stepped again into the pale and reluctant daylight, he turned sharply toward the Strand. We must begin with Rainsford's habits, said he. A man does not come into possession of a document of singular importance without leaving some trace of the manner in which he acquired it. You believe it was recent? He says so himself. 3 days. That is both a limitation and an advantage. The circle of possible sources is still narrow. We proceeded first to a modest bookseller's establishment in Chancery Lane, a place Holmes appeared to know well. The proprietor, a thin, elderly man with spectacles perched precariously upon his nose, greeted Holmes with a mixture of respect and curiosity. Mr. Holmes, it has been some time. What service may I render? You may assist me in recalling, said Holmes, always whether a gentleman of the name Septimus Rainsford has visited your shop within the last few days. The bookseller pursed his lips. Rainsford, yes, I believe so. A scholarly sort. He was here 3 days ago, as you say. Holmes's eyes flickered. And what business had he? He made inquiries, rather unusual ones, I thought at the time, asked after certain private collections, manuscripts not listed in any catalogue, very particular about provenance. Did he purchase anything? No, but I directed him elsewhere. Where? The bookseller hesitated. Well, I'm not in the habit of sending my clients to competitors, but in this case the matter was beyond my stock. I suggested he might try Mr. Gideon Fallow at Lincoln's Inn. He deals in more obscure items. Holmes inclined his head. You have been most helpful. As we left the shop, and I could not restrain my curiosity. An obscure dealer in manuscripts, said I. That sounds a promising lead. Indeed, Holmes replied, particularly when one considers that such dealers often traffic not merely in rarity, but in secrecy. Lincoln's Inn, with its solemn courts and ancient buildings, seemed an apt setting for such a trade. We found Mr. Gideon Fallow's establishment tucked away in a narrow passage, its windows dim with dust, and its sign barely legible. Within, the air was thick with the scent of old paper and leather. Shelves groaned under the weight of volumes, and in a corner, half hidden by a stack of cases, stood a man of middle years, with sharp features and eyes that missed nothing. Mr. Fallow, I presume, said Holmes. I am he, the man replied cautiously. And you are? Sherlock Holmes. This is my colleague, Doctor. Watson. We are making inquiries concerning a gentleman who visited you 3 days ago, Mr. Septimus Rainsford. At the name, a subtle change passed over Fallow's face, so slight that it might have escaped notice had not Holmes been watching with the intensity of a hawk. Yes, said Fallow slowly, I recall him. You supplied him with a document? I may have done. Holmes smiled faintly. My dear sir, equivocation will serve neither of us. The gentleman in question is now dead, Fallow started visibly. Dead? Murdered, Holmes added. There was a silence, during which Fallow's composure wavered. I had no idea, I assure you I am not. I have not accused you, said Holmes calmly. But I would be obliged if you would tell us precisely what passed between you and Mr. Rainsford. Fallow hesitated, then gave a reluctant nod.
He came to me asking for a particular manuscript, one I had only recently acquired. It was unusual. In what way? Fallow glanced toward the door as though to ensure it was closed. It had no clear origin, no author, no date. The language was English, yet not quite as we know it. There were passages, alterations, corrections made in different hands, as though the text had been rewritten over time. Holmes leaned slightly forward. Rewritten by whom? I cannot say, but the most peculiar feature was this. Certain lines appeared inconsistent with the rest, not merely in style, but in substance. Events described did not align, names changed, details shifted. I felt a chill run through me. Just as Rainsford described, I murmured. Holmes's gaze did not leave Fallow. And you sold him this manuscript? I did. Though I warned him of what? That it was not stable. Holmes's eyes gleamed. An interesting choice of word. Fallow spread his hands helplessly. I cannot explain it better. I have dealt in rare texts for 20 years, Mr. Holmes, and I have never encountered anything like it. It was as though the document itself could not decide what it contained. And where did you obtain it? Fallow hesitated again, longer this time. That, he said at last, is a matter I would prefer not to discuss. Holmes straightened, his expression hardening. I must insist. A man is dead, and the object you sold him may well be the cause. Fallow swallowed. It came to me from a private estate, a collection recently dispersed after the death of its owner. The name was... He paused, then continued reluctantly.
Alistair Crowden? Holmes exchanged a quick glance with me. The same Crowden who was known for his work in experimental linguistics? I asked. The very one, said Fallow, though some would say his interests extended beyond the boundaries of respectable scholarship. Holmes turned away, pacing slowly among the shelves. Crowden, he murmured, a man who sought to understand the structure of language itself, and perhaps believed it capable of shaping reality. He stopped abruptly. Mr. Fallow, this manuscript, did you retain any copy, any transcription, any record of its contents? None, said Fallow. I was glad to be rid of it. Holmes gave a short, decisive nod. Then we must recover the original. But if it has been taken, I began. Holmes raised a hand. Then we must find the one who took it. He turned back to Fallow.
One final question. Did anyone else inquire about this manuscript before or after Mr. Rainsford? Fallow hesitated, then said quietly, Yes. Holmes's eyes sharpened. Who? A gentleman, said Fallow, who gave no name, but there was something about him, something I didn't like. He seemed less interested in purchasing the manuscript than in ensuring that no one else possessed it. And when did he come? The day after Rainsford. Holmes's expression grew grave. Then we are already behind. As we stepped once more into the grey light of the street, I could not help but feel that the case, instead of clarifying, had deepened into something far more intricate and perilous. Holmes, said I, do you believe this unknown man is our murderer? Holmes's gaze was distant, his mind clearly racing ahead. I believe, said he slowly, show that we are dealing with an adversary who understands the value of knowledge
and the danger of it." He paused, then added in a lower tone, "and who may already have altered more than we yet perceive." Holmes walked in silence for several minutes after we left Mr. Fallow's shop, his long strides carrying us swiftly through the narrow lanes and into the broader current of the Strand. I had learned by now to resist the urge to question him too soon, for when his thoughts were in such motion, they arranged themselves best without interruption. Yet there was something in his expression, an unusual gravity, even for him, which suggested that the case had taken on a dimension beyond the merely criminal. At last he spoke. "We must consider, Watson, not only the possession of the manuscript, but its effect upon those who encounter it." "You believe it exerts some influence?" I asked. "I believe," said Holmes carefully, "that both Rainsford and Fallow independently have described a phenomenon which, though couched in different language, points to the same underlying condition, instability of recorded information." "And you attribute that to human interference?" Holmes gave a slight inclination of the head. "I attribute it to design, though whether that design lies in the document itself or in the actions of those who manipulate it remains to be determined." We had reached Fleet Street by now, and Holmes suddenly stopped before a newspaper vendor's stand. "Wait here a moment," said he. He purchased a morning edition and unfolded it with swift precision, scanning the columns. Then, with a faint exclamation, he handed it to me. "Do read the second column on the front page." I did so and found a brief notice concerning the death of one Professor Alistair Crowden, described as a reclusive scholar whose estate had recently been dispersed. "It confirms Fallow's account," I said. "Crowden is indeed the source." "Yes," said Holmes, "but note the date of death." I looked again. 5 days ago. "Precisely. And yet the estate was already being dispersed within 48 hours. That is unusually rapid for a collection of scholarly value. It suggests either urgency or intervention." "You think someone wished to ensure the manuscript was released quickly?" "Or lost quickly," Holmes replied. He took back the paper and folded it neatly. "We must visit Crowden's residence." "Is it still intact?" "If we are fortunate," said Holmes, "or it has not yet been entirely stripped." We took a hansom and drove to a quiet square in Bloomsbury, where Crowden had resided. The house, though modest in size, bore the unmistakable marks of intellectual habitation: narrow windows crowded with books, a door worn by frequent use rather than display. A solicitor's clerk answered our knock, and after some explanation, Holmes invoking both official necessity and personal authority, we were admitted. The interior was in a state of partial disarray. Shelves stood half empty, crates filled with volumes and papers lined the walls, and a faint smell of dust and old ink hung in the air. "The estate is being catalogued," said the clerk. "Most of the contents are to be auctioned." Holmes nodded. "We shall not detain you long. We require only a brief examination of the study." The clerk hesitated, and then gestured toward a door at the end of the hall. Holmes entered at once, and I followed. The study was a curious place, less orderly than Rainsford's, yet more intense. Papers lay scattered across the desk and floor, many covered in dense, cramped writing. Symbols, diagrams, and fragments of text overlapped in a manner that suggested not chaos, but a mind working at the very edge of coherence. Holmes moved swiftly among them, his eyes darting from one sheet to another. "Watson," said he, "observe this." He held up a page covered in writing. At first glance it appeared ordinary enough, but as I looked closer, I saw that certain words had been crossed out and replaced, then crossed out again and replaced once more. "Multiple revisions," I said. "Not merely revisions," Holmes replied. "Contradictions. The same sentence altered repeatedly. It's not for clarity, but for content." He laid the sheet beside another. Compare these. The 2 pages bore striking similarity, yet key details differed, names, dates, even the sequence of events described. It is as though he could not fix the text, I said. Or as though the text would not remain fixed, Holmes murmured. He turned to the desk and began opening drawers with quick, decisive movements. Most contained only more papers, but in one he paused. Ah! From within he withdrew a small leather-bound notebook. This may prove instructive. He flipped it open and began to read, his expression growing increasingly intent. Listen to this, he said, and read aloud. The structure does not hold. The words resist permanence. Each attempt to record produces divergence. It is not the ink, nor the hand, but the act itself, which introduces instability. Holmes closed the notebook slowly. Crowden was aware of the phenomenon, he said. And experimenting with it, I added. Indeed, and likely the creator or discoverer of the manuscript which came into Rainsford's possession. A faint sound from the hallway caused Holmes to look up sharply, but it was only the clerk moving about his duties. Holmes returned his attention to the notebook. There is more. He turned several pages. If language defines reality, then alteration of language may alter perception, or more. But control is elusive. The text changes beyond intention. It must be constrained. Holmes snapped the notebook shut. Constrained, he repeated. An attempt to fix what cannot be fixed. Then the manuscript may be the result of such an attempt, said Holmes. Dulks a document in which the instability of language has been captured, or perhaps unleashed. I felt a growing unease. And if someone has now obtained it? Holmes met my gaze. Then they possess not merely a curiosity, but a tool, one capable of distorting the very evidence upon which truth depends. There was a pause. Holmes, I said quietly, if records can be altered after the fact, if words themselves are unreliable, how are we to proceed? A faint smile touched his lips. My dear Watson, we must do what we have always done, and that is, rely not upon what is written, said Sherlock Holmes, but upon what cannot be altered. He turned back to the room, his eyes scanning it with renewed intensity. Physical fact, direct observation, and above all, consistency. He tapped the notebook lightly. For if this manuscript introduces inconsistency, then the one who wields it must leave behind traces of that inconsistency. And those traces will lead us to him? Holmes's eyes gleamed. They must, said he, for no man, however clever, can alter everything without revealing something. Holmes replaced the notebook with care, though not before slipping a small slip of paper from between its pages into his own pocket-book, a movement so swift and natural that it might have escaped notice had I not stood close beside him. You have found something? I whispered. Perhaps, he murmured. Or perhaps something has found us. We shall see which proves the case. He cast one final sweeping glance about Crowden's study, then turned decisively toward the door. We have lingered long enough. The pattern is forming. Ask Watson, but it is not yet complete. Outside, the grey light had strengthened, though the air still carried that faint, oppressive heaviness which seemed, in my imagination at least, to mirror the strange distortion of events with which we were confronted. We had scarcely reached the corner of the square when Holmes stopped abruptly. Observe, said he quietly. A man stood across the street, half-turned as though examining the window of a shop, yet his posture bore that unmistakable stiffness of one who watches without wishing to appear to do so. He has been there since we exited the house, Holmes continued. He glanced once too often toward the door. You think he follows us? I am certain of it. Holmes resumed walking, though now at a more leisurely pace. We shall not discourage him, he added. On the contrary,
We shall invite his persistence. He led me through a series of turns, now along a crowded thoroughfare, now into a narrower lane, his movements seemingly aimless, yet I soon perceived that each turn served to confirm the presence of our pursuer. The man appeared again and again, always at a distance, always careful, yet never quite absent. At last Holmes turned sharply into a quiet cul-de-sac and halted. The man, caught off guard, hesitated, but too late. Holmes was upon him in an instant. "My dear sir," said he pleasantly, "you have taken a most circuitous route this morning. Might I inquire whether your destination coincides with ours?" The man flushed and attempted a laugh. "You mistake me, sir. I was merely, following us," Holmes finished. "Quite so. Now, since we have spared you the trouble of concealment—"
Perhaps you will favour us with your purpose." The fellow hesitated, his eyes darting between us. He was of respectable appearance, though his clothes bore the slight disarray of haste. "I meant no harm," he said at last. "I was instructed only to observe." "By whom?" The man swallowed. "I do not know his name." Holmes's expression hardened. "Then you will describe him." "He is tall, very pale, his manner—" The man shivered slightly. "There is something cold about him. He came to me yesterday, offered payment if I would watch a certain house, and report who entered or left." "Bell Yard," said Holmes. "Yes." "And this morning?" "He told me to follow two gentlemen, one tall, one military, and note their movements." Holmes exchanged a brief glance with me. "Did he give you any further instruction?" "Only that if you visited Crowden's house—"
I was to return at once and inform him. Holmes leaned closer. "And where were you to find him?" The man hesitated. "At a place near Holborn, a lodging-house." Holmes's eyes flashed. "You will take us there?" I cannot—" Holmes's voice became suddenly cold as steel. "You will, for if you do not, I shall place you in the hands of Inspector Lestrade as an accessory to a murder investigation. Choose." The man's resistance collapsed at once. "Very well, I will take you." We set off at once, the man leading, though with evident reluctance. Holmes walked beside him, his gaze fixed, his entire bearing that of a hunter closing upon his quarry. "This unknown gentleman," Holmes said quietly, "has shown considerable foresight. He anticipates our movements, places watchers, and seeks to intercept information at its source." "And perhaps already possesses the manuscript," I added. "Almost certainly," said Holmes, "which raises the question, why has he not fled? To use it?" "Or to complete something begun," Holmes replied. We soon arrived at a narrow street near Holborn, where the man indicated a modest lodging-house of unremarkable appearance. "He is within," said our guide nervously. "At least, he was when I left." Holmes did not hesitate. He mounted the steps and knocked sharply. After a moment, the door was opened by a landlady who regarded us with suspicion. "Yes." Holmes stepped forward. "We seek a gentleman lodging here. Tall, pale—" But before he could finish, a sudden sound came from within, a crash, followed by the unmistakable hurried movement of someone attempting escape.
Holmes sprang past the astonished woman and dashed up the stairs, eye closed behind him. At the top of the landing, a door stood ajar. Holmes flung it wide. The room beyond was empty. Yet the window at the far end stood open, the curtain stirring faintly in the cold air. Holmes crossed the room in 2 strides and looked out. "Too late," he said softly. I joined him. Below, the narrow alley was deserted save for a stray cat slipping between shadows. "He has escaped," I said. "For the moment," Holmes replied. He turned back into the room, his gaze sweeping rapidly over its contents. A small table, a chair, a bed, nothing remarkable at first glance. Yet Holmes moved with swift precision, examining each item in turn. Then he stopped. Upon the table lay a single sheet of paper. Holmes picked it up carefully. "Well," said he.
Our adversary has not departed without leaving us a message." He handed it to me. The words were written in a neat, controlled hand. "You are closer than he was, but not close enough." A chill ran through me. "He knows us," I said. Holmes's lips curved into a thin, dangerous smile. "Oh yes," said he quietly. "And now, Watson, so do we know him." He folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket. "The game," said Sherlock Holmes, "has at last begun in earnest." Holmes remained for several moments in the centre of the small lodging room, the slip of paper still between his fingers, his gaze moving slowly from object to object, as though each might yield some final fragment of meaning. I had come to recognize that particular stillness in him. It was not inactivity,
But rather the moment in which scattered facts aligned into a pattern only he could yet perceive. At last he spoke. "He did not flee in panic," said he quietly. "He departed with intention and with time enough to choose what to leave behind." "You believe the note itself is part of his design?" "Undoubtedly. Our adversary is not merely cautious, Watson. He is theatrical. He wishes to be understood, but only to a certain degree. He reveals just enough to guide and conceals the rest to control." Holmes crossed once more to the window and examined the sill with his lens. "No haste in his exit," he continued. "See here, the marks are clean, deliberate. He anticipated our arrival within a narrow margin and withdrew accordingly." "And yet he left this," I said, indicating the note. Holmes smiled faintly. "Yes."
Because the true message is not in the words, but in the choice of words." I looked again at the paper. "You are closer than he was, but not close enough." "What do you infer from it?" I asked. "That he compares us to Rainsford," said Holmes, "which implies he has knowledge of Rainsford's investigation, or at least of his conclusions. Then he must have observed him closely, or altered the circumstances under which he observed," Holmes replied. He moved to the table and placed the note beside the objects already there. "Now consider. Rainsford becomes aware of inconsistencies. He attempts to record them. He summons us. He is silenced. The manuscript disappears. And now we encounter a man who anticipates our movements, monitors our progress,
And communicates in a manner designed to unsettle. You believe he is the murderer? Holmes did not answer immediately. I believe, said he at last, that he is either the murderer or the only one who knows precisely how the murder was accomplished. There was a pause. And the manuscript? I asked. Holmes's eyes narrowed. That is the fulcrum upon which the entire case turns. He turned suddenly toward the door. Come, Watson, there is no more to be gained here. Our next step lies not in pursuit but in reconstruction. Reconstruction? We must understand how the manuscript operates, at least in part. For until we do, we are at a disadvantage. We returned to Baker Street with all speed, Holmes silent and absorbed. Once within our sitting room, he at once cleared the table and laid out the materials we had gathered, Rainsford's letter, Crowden's notebook, and the slip taken from within it. You observed my little abstraction earlier, said he, tapping the pocket where he had concealed the additional paper. Now we shall see whether it justifies itself. He unfolded it carefully. It was a fragment, no more than a torn piece of a larger page. Yet upon it were several lines of writing, densely packed and heavily corrected. Holmes placed it beside Rainsford's letter. Now, Watson, read these aloud. I complied. The fragment read, "The sequence cannot be trusted. Each iteration produces divergence. Fixing the text requires external anchoring, something beyond alteration." Holmes nodded. "External anchoring," he repeated. "Or that is the key." "You mean something that cannot be changed?" "Precisely. Something outside the system of written language, something physical, immutable." "Like the blotter impressions," I said suddenly. Holmes's eyes lit up. "Excellent, Watson. You see the direction at last. The written word may be altered, but the pressure it leaves behind, the physical trace, remains." He began pacing rapidly. Rainsford wrote his letter. The words may have shifted, but the impressions upon the blotter retained their original form. That is why we saw divergence between what was written and what had been written. "And Crowden knew this," I said. "He was searching for a way to stabilize the text." "Or to control it," Holmes added. He stopped abruptly. "And now we must ask, has our adversary succeeded where Crowden failed?" A silence fell between us. "I can't if he has," I said slowly. "Then he could alter documents at will, records, testimony, anything written." "And thereby reshape perception," said Holmes. "Not reality itself, Watson, but the record of it. And in a world that depends upon records, that is power of the highest order." I felt a chill. "And Rainsford discovered this, and was killed for it?" "Most likely." Holmes returned to the table and examined the fragment once more. "There is something else," he said. "Note this phrase, external anchoring. If such an anchor exists, then the manuscript must have some limitation, some boundary beyond which it cannot alter. And if we find that boundary, we may counter it," Holmes finished. At that moment, there came a sharp knock at the door. Holmes looked up, his expression instantly alert. "Come in." Mrs. Hudson entered, holding a small envelope. "A messenger brought this just now, Mr. Holmes. He would not give his name." Holmes took the envelope and opened it swiftly. Inside was a single card. He read it, and for a moment his face was utterly still. "Well?" I asked. Holmes handed it to me. Upon it were written only 3 words, "Belliard, tonight." I looked up sharply. "It is from him." "Undoubtedly." "And he invites us?" Holmes's eyes gleamed with a mixture of anticipation and something darker. "No, Watson," said he softly. "He summons us." He took up his hat and set it firmly upon his head. "And I think," he added, "it would be most unwise to refuse." Holmes spent the remaining hours of the afternoon in a state of intense preparation, though to the casual observer it might have appeared as little more than quiet arrangement. Yet I, who knew him well, to perceive the significance of each action. He wrote several brief notes, dispatched by hand. He examined once more the fragment from Crowden's notebook, committing it, so I believe, to memory. Most curious of all, he selected from a drawer a small leather case, which he slipped into his inner pocket without comment. "You anticipate danger," said I. Holmes glanced at me. "My dear Watson, I anticipate design. Danger is merely one of its possible expressions." "And we go alone?" "For the present," he replied, "though I have taken the liberty of ensuring that we are not without contingency." His tone suggested no more would be said, and indeed he soon fell once more into silence. As evening drew in, the fog returned, creeping low along the streets like some deliberate and watchful presence. By the time we set out, and London was once again wrapped in that muffled half-world where distance and direction seemed uncertain. Belliard appeared much as before, though now it bore a different character to my eye, not merely the scene of a crime, but the appointed stage for some further act in a drama whose script we had yet to fully comprehend. The house itself stood dark. No light I observed. Holmes nodded. As expected. He approached the door and tried the handle. It yielded at once. "Unlocked," said he softly. An invitation. We entered. The interior lay in shadow, the air stale and undisturbed. Holmes closed the door behind us with deliberate care. "Remain close, Watson," he murmured, "and observe everything." We ascended the narrow stair, our steps sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. At the landing, Holmes paused, listening, and there was no sound save the faint creak of the building settling. He pushed open the door to Rainsford's former room. A single lamp burned upon the table. The room was otherwise unchanged, yet something in the arrangement struck me at once as different, though I could not immediately say what. Holmes, however, had already moved forward. "He is here," he said quietly. From the far side of the room, where the shadows gathered thickest, a voice answered. "Indeed." A figure stepped into the lamplight. He was tall, as our informant had described, and of a pallor so pronounced that it seemed almost unnatural against the dim glow. His features were fine, his expression composed, yet there was in his eyes a cold intensity that arrested the attention at once. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," said he, inclining his head slightly, "and I have long wished to make your acquaintance." Holmes returned the gesture with equal composure. "The feeling, I assure you, is mutual." The man's gaze shifted briefly to me. "And, Dr. Watson, your chronicles have proven most instructive." I felt a slight tightening in my chest at the remark, though I held my ground. "You have the advantage of us," said Holmes. "You know our names, our habits, our movements. Yet we have only the outline of your involvement." The man smiled faintly. "Then allow me to correct that imbalance, partially." He stepped closer to the table, the lamplight falling fully upon his face. "My name is Adrian Voss." Holmes's eyes flickered, though his expression did not otherwise change. "A name unknown to me," said he. "Not for long," Voss replied. There was a pause. "You summoned us," Holmes continued.
To what end?" "To conclude what was begun," said Voss. Mr. Rainsford was insufficient. He perceived the disturbance, but lacked the discipline to understand it. "And you," said Holmes, "possess that discipline?" "I possess," Voss replied calmly, "control." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Of the manuscript?" Voss inclined his head slightly. "You are perceptive. And Rainsford's death?" Voss's expression did not alter. "A necessity. He had already compromised the experiment." "By seeking assistance?" "By failing to comprehend the nature of what he held," Voss said. "He treated it as a curiosity. It is not a curiosity, it is a mechanism." Holmes took a step forward. "A mechanism for altering recorded information." "For refining it," Voss corrected. "For removing inconsistency, for imposing coherence where none existed." Holmes's eyes gleamed.
"Seldom yet all evidence suggests the opposite, that the text becomes unstable, divergent." "Only in untrained hands," said Voss. He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document. The flaw in Crowden's work was not the principle, but the method. He allowed the text to evolve without constraint. I have corrected that error. Holmes's voice was very quiet. By introducing an anchor. Voss's smile deepened ever so slightly. "You see more than most." "And the anchor?" Holmes pressed. "What form does it take?" Voss held the document lightly between his fingers. "That, Mr. Holmes, is the question which has occupied me, and now, you." There was a tension in the room, a stillness charged with something unseen yet palpable. "You invited us here," Holmes said, "not merely to speak, but to demonstrate." Voss inclined his head.
"Oh, precisely." He placed the document upon the table. I wished to observe whether you would recognize the nature of the change. Holmes did not move at once. What change? I asked. Voss's eyes flickered toward me. The one that has already occurred? A sudden unease seized me. Holmes! But Holmes raised a hand. Wait! He stepped forward at last and looked down at the paper. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, very slowly, he reached into his pocket and withdrew Rainsford's letter. He placed the two documents side by side. Watson, said he quietly, read the first line of Rainsford's letter. I did so. If this reaches you, then the world is no longer the one in which I first put pen to paper. And now, said Holmes, read it again. I looked down. The words had changed. Not entirely, but enough. My breath caught. Holmes, it now reads. Yes, he said softly. Across the table, Adrian Voss watched us with calm, unwavering interest. Now you begin to understand, said he. Holmes lifted his gaze, and for the first time since we had entered the room, I saw in his eyes not merely calculation, but something deeper, recognition. The alteration is no longer passive, said Holmes. It is directed. Voss inclined his head once more. At last, he said, we may proceed. For a moment, neither Holmes nor I spoke. The silence seemed to thicken in the room, as though the very air had become subject to the same subtle distortion that afflicted the written word. I forced my eyes once more to the letter, scarcely trusting them. Holmes, I said, my voice lower than I intended. The phrase, it has altered.
It now reads, the world is no longer the one in which I first began to write. Just so, said Holmes calmly. But that is a trivial change, I insisted. A matter of phrasing. A matter of sequence, Holmes corrected. And sequence, Watson, is the foundation of all record. He turned back to Voss. You have not merely altered the words, you have altered their order of conception. The meaning shifts subtly but significantly. Rainsford no longer speaks of a completed act, but of one in progress. Voss's expression showed the faintest trace of approval. You grasp the principle. The text is no longer static, it is iterative. Each reading produces a new alignment constrained by the anchor. And the anchor, said Holmes, is not the text itself, but something external, something fixed, against which the variations are measured. Voss's eyes gleamed. Precisely. Holmes's gaze flicked briefly to the table, then to the blotter beneath it. The physical trace, he murmured. The pressure, the sequence of strokes, those remain unchanged. Voss inclined his head, which is why Mr. Rainsford, though perceptive, was ultimately doomed. He saw the inconsistency, but not the structure beneath it. And you have imposed that structure, said Holmes. I have refined it, Voss replied. What Crowden began as an experiment, I have completed as a system. Holmes folded his arms. To what end? Voss did not answer at once. Instead, he moved slowly around the table, his fingers resting lightly upon its edge. You of all men, Mr. Holmes, must appreciate the fragility of truth. How often does it depend upon written record? A statement, a contract, a testimony? Alter the record, and you alter the perception of events. You propose to control reality by controlling its documentation, said Holmes. I propose, said Voss quietly, to eliminate error. Holmes gave a short, dry laugh. By introducing controlled distortion? By introducing precision, Voss replied. The world as it stands is riddled with inconsistency, contradictions, ambiguities, false accounts. My method allows for correction, refinement, alignment. At the cost, said Holmes, of objective truth. Voss's gaze sharpened. There is no objective truth, Mr. Holmes, only consensus, and consensus is built upon record. Holmes took a step forward. You speak as though you stand outside that system, yet you rely upon it as much as any man. I rely upon my ability to shape it, Voss replied. There was a tension now, palpable and growing. And Rainsford? I asked. Was he merely an inconvenience to be removed? Voss's eyes flickered toward me. He was a variable that could not be controlled. And so you eliminated him? Yes. The simplicity of the admission sent a chill through me. Holmes, however, showed no outward reaction. You are confident, said he, that your system is complete? I am certain of it. And that it cannot be countered? Voss's smile returned, faint but unmistakable. I invited you here precisely because I wished to test that assumption. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Then you have not yet proven it to yourself? Not fully, Voss admitted. And you, Mr. Holmes, we represent the most rigorous test available. Holmes inclined his head slightly. You do me honour. On the contrary, said Voss, I offer you opportunity. He gestured toward the document upon the table. Examine it, analyze it, attempt to detect the structure, the constraint, the anchor. If you succeed, he paused, then you will have demonstrated a limitation in my design. And if I fail, Holmes asked, then you will have confirmed its perfection. Holmes was silent for a moment. Then slowly he reached into his inner pocket and withdrew the small leather case I had seen him select earlier. You speak of perfection, said he, yet you overlook a fundamental principle. Voss watched him closely. And that is? That no system, said Holmes, opening the case, can account for that which lies entirely outside its domain. Within the case was a small, finely crafted instrument, a compact mechanical device, the nature of which I could not at once determine. Voss's eyes narrowed. What is that? A safeguard, said Holmes. One I deemed prudent, given the nature of your experiment. He placed the device upon the table beside the documents. You rely upon written record, Holmes continued. But what of that which is not written? Voss's expression darkened slightly. Speak plainly. Holmes's voice was calm, but there was a new edge to it. Every alteration you have demonstrated affects the text, but not the memory of the observer. Watson and I perceived the change because we had already read the original. Your system cannot retroactively alter direct experience. Voss's lips curved.
A memory is notoriously unreliable. Indeed, said Holmes, which is why I have not relied upon it alone. He gestured toward the device. This instrument records, not in ink, but in mechanical sequence, each movement, each position, fixed, immutable. Voss's gaze flicked to it, then back to Holmes. You propose to anchor the record externally. Precisely. There was a moment's silence. Then Voss laughed softly. A clever attempt, Mr. Holmes, but insufficient. Is it? Holmes asked. Voss reached forward and placed his hand lightly upon the document. Observe. Holmes did not move, neither did I. Voss's fingers traced a line upon the page. Now, said he, read it again. Holmes glanced down, I followed. The words had shifted once more, but this time, Holmes! I exclaimed. The device, it has... Holmes's gaze snapped to the instrument.
Or for the first time I saw uncertainty in his expression. The device, whatever its purpose, had not remained unchanged. Its position had altered, subtly but unmistakably. Voss's voice was very quiet. You see the limitation of your approach. The system extends beyond the written word. It encompasses all recorded sequence. Holmes straightened slowly. Then the anchor is not physical alone, he said. It is relational. Voss inclined his head. At last, he said, you begin to approach the truth. Holmes's eyes burned with intensity. And that truth, he said softly, is not yet complete. Holmes did not at once reply. He stood very still, his gaze fixed not upon Voss, nor upon the shifting text, but upon the table itself, as though seeking beneath the visible confusion some deeper constant which had not yet revealed itself. When he spoke, and it was with a quiet certainty that caused even Voss to incline his head in sharper attention. "No," said Holmes softly. "It is not complete." Voss regarded him with interest. "Then enlighten me." Holmes's hand moved slowly across the table, not touching the document, nor the altered instrument, but resting instead upon the wooden surface itself. "You have extended the system beyond written language," he continued. "You have incorporated positional relationships, objects in space, sequences in time. But even so, you rely upon a framework." "And what framework is that?" Voss asked. Holmes's eyes lifted. "Observation," said he. "Human observation." Voss's expression did not change, but I sensed a tightening beneath his composure. "You assume that perception can be excluded from the system," he said. "I do not assume it," Holmes replied.
I assert it." He turned to me. "Watson, you are a medical man. Tell me, what is the one faculty which no external system can fully anticipate?" I hesitated. "The human will?" I ventured. Holmes shook his head. "More fundamental." "The senses?" "Closer." He turned back to Voss. "It is attention," said Holmes. "Selective, directed, conscious attention. Your system alters recorded sequence, but it cannot predict in advance the exact moment at which an observer will fix upon a detail and retain it independently of all subsequent alteration." Voss's eyes narrowed. "A subtle distinction?" "A decisive one," Holmes replied. He reached suddenly forward, not to the document, but to the blotter beneath it, and lifted it sharply. "Watson, now!" I did not fully understand his intent, but instinctively I obeyed.
I fixing my gaze upon the underside where the faint impressions lay. "Do not look away," Holmes said. Voss moved at once. "Stop!" But Holmes was faster. He seized the document and turned it over, pressing it firmly against the blotter. "Now," said he, "we compare what was written with what is written simultaneously." For a fraction of a second, nothing seemed to occur. Then, "Good God!" I exclaimed. The impressions upon the blotter, fixed, physical, remained as they had been. Yet the text upon the page, now aligned against them, no longer matched. Lines diverged, words misaligned, entire phrases failed to correspond with the pressure marks beneath them. Holmes's voice cut through the moment. "There! The system cannot reconcile both states at once." Voss's composure faltered, only slightly, but enough. "You force a contradiction," he said. "Oh, I reveal one," Holmes replied. He held the paper firmly in place. "You have created a mechanism which alters sequence, but you cannot eliminate all prior states. The physical trace remains as a record of what was, while the text becomes what you intend it to be. When the two are brought into direct comparison, the inconsistency is exposed." Voss's gaze hardened. "A temporary effect. The system will resolve it?" "No," said Holmes quietly. "It cannot, because the anchor you have chosen is not absolute. It is relational. It depends upon separation, upon the observer encountering each state independently. When forced into simultaneity, the structure collapses." There was a silence. Then Voss spoke, his voice lower. "You underestimate the adaptability of the system." Holmes's eyes gleamed.
On the contrary, I have identified its limit." In that instant, Voss moved. His hand darted toward the document, but Holmes anticipated him. With a swift motion, he drew the paper back and stepped away, placing the table between them. "Inspector Lestrade?" he called sharply. The door burst open. Lestrade and two constables rushed in, their presence so sudden and decisive that even Voss was taken aback. "You're just in time," said Holmes calmly. "This gentleman has a great deal to answer for." Voss's gaze flickered from Holmes to the officers, then back again. For a moment I thought he might attempt escape, but instead he straightened, his composure returning like a mask settling into place. "You believe this proves anything?" he said. "It proves enough," Holmes replied.
The contradictions you have introduced cannot withstand direct comparison. Your system depends upon isolation, upon controlling what is seen, and when remove that control, and it fails. Lestrade stepped forward. "I'll take that as sufficient cause," he said, briskly. "Adrian Voss, you are under arrest for the murder of Septimus Rainsford." Voss did not resist as the constables seized him. "This is not the end," he said quietly. "The principle remains." "Perhaps," said Holmes, "but you will not be the one to exploit it." As Voss was led from the room, his pale face turned once more toward us. "You have delayed it," he said. "Nothing more." The door closed behind him. For a long moment none of us spoke. Then Lestrade turned to Holmes. "Well, Mr. Holmes," he said, "I'll admit I don't pretend to understand half of what's gone on here."
But I gather you've solved it." Holmes gave a faint smile. "Solved it? No, Inspector. I have merely prevented it from proceeding further." He looked down at the document still in his hand. "This," he added, "is something far more dangerous than a single crime." I felt a lingering unease. "And the manuscript?" I asked. Holmes's expression grew thoughtful. "It must be secured," said he. "And studied carefully? For while Voss sought to control it, Crowden sought to understand it. Between those two aims lies the difference between knowledge and catastrophe." Lestrade shook his head. "I'll leave the philosophy to you, Mr. Holmes. For my part, I'll see that the man is locked up." He departed with the constables. Holmes remained by the table, the altered document before him, the blotter still bearing its silent testimony beneath. At last,
He turned to me. "Come, Watson," said he. "There is nothing more to be done here tonight." As we stepped once more into the fog, I could not help but glance back at the darkened window of Bell Yard. "Holmes," I said, "do you believe the danger is truly over?" He was silent for a moment. Then he answered. "No," said Sherlock Holmes quietly. "Only contained." The days which followed the arrest of Adrian Voss were outwardly uneventful. Scotland Yard proceeded with its customary efficiency, though I gathered from Lestrade's occasional remarks that the formal charges, however solid in the matter of Rainsford's death, left much of the deeper affair unspoken, if not altogether uncomprehended. As for Holmes, he withdrew into one of those periods of intense, silent labour which I had often observed in the wake of a case whose implications extended beyond the immediate crime. The manuscript, secured at his insistence and kept under conditions of what he termed controlled observation, occupied the greater portion of his attention. For my own part, I confess that I approached the matter with a lingering unease. The events at Bell Yard had shaken me more profoundly than I had at first admitted, for they touched not merely upon crime, but upon the very reliability of those faculties by which we perceive and record the world. It was on the third evening after Voss's arrest that Holmes at last spoke at length upon the matter. We sat together in our familiar chairs at Baker Street, the fire burning low, the lamplight steady and reassuring. Yet I could not wholly shake the memory of how easily such certainties might be called into question. "Well, Watson," said Holmes, "you have been patient. It is time, I think, that I lay before you the full chain of reasoning." "I should be most grateful," I replied, "for though I grasp the outline, the deeper mechanism remains obscure to me." Holmes inclined his head. "Let us begin at the beginning. Crowden, a man of considerable intellectual ambition, sought to explore the relationship between language and perception. He hypothesized, correctly in part, that the structure of recorded language influences the interpretation of events." "And went further," I said, "in attempting to alter that structure." "Precisely. But he encountered a fundamental difficulty: instability. The text, once altered, would not remain fixed. Each attempt to refine it introduced further divergence. Hence the contradictions we observed." "Just so. Crowden's failure lay in his inability to constrain the system. He lacked an anchor." "And Voss supplied one," I said. Holmes steepled his fingers. "Not quite. Voss believed he had supplied one. In truth, he misunderstood the nature of the constraint required." I leaned forward. "You mean the blotter, the physical trace?" "Partially. The physical trace is one form of anchoring, but not the most fundamental. The true limitation lies in simultaneity." "Simultaneity?" Holmes nodded. "Voss's system functions only so long as the observer encounters each version of the record in isolation. The moment two conflicting states are presented together, the system cannot reconcile them. It collapses into contradiction." "Which is what you demonstrated at Belliard." "Exactly. By forcing the altered text and the original impression into direct comparison, I created a condition his mechanism could not resolve. And that revealed the truth." "It revealed the inconsistency," said Holmes, "which in such a system is equivalent to truth." I considered this. "Then Voss's power was never absolute?" "Never," Holmes replied. "It depended entirely upon control, of sequence, of access, of observation. Remove that control, and the illusion fails." "And Rainsford?" Holmes's expression softened slightly. "Rainsford perceived the effect, but not the structure. He noticed the changes, but could not isolate their cause. In seeking assistance, he threatened Voss's control, and thus sealed his fate." "And the manuscript now?" I asked. Holmes rose and crossed to a locked drawer. From it he withdrew a sealed packet, which he placed upon the table between us. "It remains dangerous," he said. "Not because it alters reality, as Voss believed, but because it alters confidence in reality. And that, Watson, is a far subtler and more insidious power." "You intend to destroy it?" Holmes paused. "I have considered it. Yet destruction, in such cases, is seldom final. Knowledge, once uncovered, has a way of resurfacing. Better, I think, that it be understood and contained." "Contained as Voss attempted?" Holmes smiled faintly. "No, contained by awareness. So long as its limitations are known, its influence can be countered." He returned to his chair. "The true lesson of this case is not that records may be altered, but that no alteration is complete. There is always a residue, some fragment of consistency which remains beyond manipulation. And it is upon that fragment," I said, "that truth must be built." "Precisely." There was a moment of quiet reflection. "And Voss?" I asked. Holmes's expression grew distant. "He will be tried and likely condemned, yet I suspect that even in confinement his mind will continue to pursue the same line of inquiry. Men of that temperament rarely abandon their obsessions." "And do you believe he was entirely wrong?" I ventured. Holmes regarded me thoughtfully. "No," said he at last. "That is what makes him dangerous." The fire had burned low, and Holmes rose to stir it. The flames leapt up once more, casting shifting shadows upon the walls. "In the end, Watson," he continued, "we are left with a paradox. the more we seek to fix reality through record, and the more we expose it to distortion. Yet without record we have no means of preserving truth at all. And your conclusion? Holmes turned back, his eyes clear and steady. That truth, said Sherlock Holmes, does not reside in any single account, but in the convergence of many, where consistency endures across all forms, written, observed, remembered. There, and only there, may we trust what we perceive. He took up his violin at last, and this time the bow moved across the strings with a quiet, reflective melody, one that seemed to resolve, at least in part, the disquiet that had lingered since that strange night at Bell Yard. As for myself, I have set down this account with the greatest care, mindful of the peculiar nature of the events it describes. If there be any discrepancy within it, I can only hope that it lies not in the facts themselves, but in the limitations of the hand that records them. For I have learned, in the company of Sherlock Holmes, that while reality may be questioned, the pursuit of truth must remain, above all, constant.